audio on. Okay. How do I mute my...
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webcast today. Please make sure that you are muted on your own computers. So I want to thank everyone for joining our webcast today with Ipsos. My name is Zina Pagan, ARF's Marketing Manager, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin learning about the 2016 U.S. election, I will go over a few housekeeping items. The audio will be streamed. You will be able to hear us through your computer speakers or headphones, should you prefer. Should you have any questions during the session, please send these using the chat function. I will submit these to our presenters, but unfortunately they do have a short window of participation with us today, so these questions will be addressed personally after the event. We will have this session recorded. If you would like to view the recorded event, it will be available on demand within 2 weeks from today. If you're interested in hosting a webcast, please contact Daniel Bulgren at dbulgren@thearf.org or myself at zina@thearf.org. Now for an update for the ARF. We do have a few events that are coming up. Our next webcast is April 6th, and we are going to focus on timing is everything, purchase-driven planning, the new ROI paradigm, and that will be presented by Nielsen Catalina. If you're in the Minneapolis area, please join us on April 12th. We will feature our cross-platform event at United Health. And also, just to skip over a few of these events, we do have our audience measurement conference here in New York City. Those dates are June 12th to the 14th. We've added another day to the program, so instead of the 13th, it's the 12th. Early bird rates do expire on April 15th, so don't wait too long to purchase your tickets at a discounted rate. If you are interested in any of these programs or registering for any of these events, please do let me know, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with the right parties at the ARF. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Jim Meyer, Ipsos's Chief Marketing Officer, who will introduce our speakers.
Thanks very much, Zina. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the Inside Track on this wild and crazy U.S. presidential election currently underway. Thanks, too, to the ARF for allowing us to kick off Webcast Wednesday. I'm Jim Meyer. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Ipsos in North America. This session is part of a larger webinar series, a monthly series sponsored by Ipsos, which is open for registration independently. But this session in particular is designed to examine the key election dynamics going on right now and help you understand the science of election prediction in the process. So with no further ado, let me introduce Julia Clark and Chris Jackson, who are polling and election experts with Ipsos Public Affairs. Chris, Julia, take it away.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this third briefing. We hope you've managed to join for some of the earlier ones as well, and if not, we encourage you to put us on your calendar. I believe the next of these is going to be on April 22nd. So please do continue signing up and having a look at the recordings that we do put up. Before we kick off and get into the detail of some of the important things going on this cycle, welcome, I just wanted to do a little bit of sort of blatant self-promotion. The handles and the hashtags you see here are some of the ways that Ipsos communicates our election data, as well as our analysis and comments. We often live tweet primaries, certainly the election, of course, the debates, that kind of thing. And it's typically a lot of fun. Some of our sort of properties are here. The Ipsos ones to follow that'll contain a lot of the information, the types of things that we're talking about on these sessions, as well as our poll releases are at Ipsos PA, which is Public Affairs, and Ipsos NA, which is North America. So both of those domains, as well as our general news and polls Twitter handle. And _Ipsos is for, it's more of a global Twitter handle, but it often will carry news from elections here as well as around the world. As a personal plug, my own Twitter account, which is a professional one, as well as Chris and our president, Cliff, are all here as well. And the polling that we do for Reuters is publicized via these different Twitter accounts as well. Chris Kahn is the data editor at Reuters in the U.S., and that's that final Twitter handle there. If you are live tweeting this, which we encourage you to do, or to reference it after the fact, there are a couple of hashtags here that we use regularly. And on a more lighthearted note, a few of the folks on my team have started a highly entertaining and much beloved Instagram account detailing the day-to-day lives of the statisticians at Ipsos. So that's more for fun than for politics. But we just wanted to give you the opportunity to review some of these. Right, on to the meat of this conversation. We're going to touch on a few key themes that we think are really, the most important right now at this point in the cycle, given the events of the last few weeks especially. Chris is going to talk a bit about the convention, and a real possibility of a contested Republican convention. I'm going to talk a little bit about turnout and what we've been seeing in the primaries and what that may speak to for the general election in November. Chris is then going to talk a little bit more about the dynamics going on within the Republican Party right now in their primary process, and then we'll take, as always, some questions. So without any further ado, Chris, over to you, please.
Thanks, Julia. So great to be here today with everyone. Great to be speaking with everyone. Anybody who's been paying attention to the political coverage of the last couple of weeks has probably heard some of this buzz about a contested or a brokered convention, usually spoken about with the Republicans. Well, we want to start off just sort of talking about what is a contested convention. You may know that the primaries aren't really about the popular vote totals. Instead, what they're really about is deciding how many delegates for which candidates are going to get sent to the Republican and Democratic conventions being held this summer in July. And it is actually those delegates at the convention who vote on who is going to essentially be the party's nominee. Now, most states have rules in place now that the delegates sent to the convention are bound to follow the state popular vote totals, which is why the candidates are campaigning in the states rather than just trying to glad hand the individual delegates. However, the rules are that a candidate has to get a majority of the delegates on a vote at the convention to win the nomination. For the Republican Party, a candidate needs to get 1,237 delegates to have a majority. However, the large number of candidates in the field has meant that the vote has been split so far in the Republican primary, and Donald Trump, the frontrunner, has not been winning a majority of the delegates so far. So he's actually been winning about 46% of the delegates that have been awarded to date. On the graph, on the chart, you can see that there is two trend lines. This dark red line is the total number of delegates that have been awarded by the date of various elections. So you can see Super Tuesday here, March 15th, that's when Ohio and Florida was held, and then June 7th is the last round of primaries, specifically, most prominently California. I mean, you can see this orange line is the number of delegates Trump has won over that time period, and he's currently at 738. That is 46% of the delegates that have been awarded to date. And that is interesting because if you just keep that 46% number he's been winning and project it out, you get to this simple model, which is 1,124 delegates. If he continues winning at the same rate, he doesn't win enough delegates to get the majority, the 1,237 he needs. However, some of the states have rules where the guy who wins the most votes in the states gets all the delegates in the states rather than a proportion of them. And if Trump wins in all the places we're expecting him to win, he'll actually come up with 1,236 delegates, so one less than he needs for the majority. However, we've been doing some additional analysis of the likely results moving forward now that the field has narrowed down to 3 candidates, and we actually think that he's most likely going to end up with about 1,300 delegates total, somewhere between 1,300 and 1,320. which is well above the threshold he needs to win the majority of delegates and win the Republican primary. So we actually think that a Republican contested convention is not very likely this year. However, it is still possible. You know, it is still possible something else can happen between now and then to limit Trump's vote total to below this 1237 threshold. And take us to a contested convention. And the other thing I want to note is you can see here there's this spike here at the last date of the primaries, June 7th. That's when a bunch of states, most notably California, have their primary. And it's actually almost impossible for Trump to get over this 1237 line until that date. There's just not enough delegates left available for him to win unless he starts winning at a vastly increased rate. So that means that the Republican primary is probably going to continue for another 2.5 months from where we are now to June 7th, when they'll finally apportion out enough delegates for Trump to probably win the nomination. So,
Yeah. Sorry, Chris.
No, go ahead.
And I was just going to add to that before I jump in to talk about the turnout gap, which was to say, and I'll go back to that one slide because I think this is so critical, is that, yeah, I mean, we're not going to have a nominee, I don't think, right until June 7th, per Chris's point, because, you know, neither of the other two candidates, Kasich nor Cruz, show any real signs of being inclined to drop out. Of course, that could change, and, you know, deals often occur behind the scenes. But it means that it's going to be a long primary season, and that we're going to be waiting and waiting and waiting. And the more qualitative point on this brokered convention or contested convention point I wanted to make is one that Cliff Young, who's the president of public affairs, has been making in the press lately, which is that if Trump is so close, if he's within a couple of delegate counts of 1237, where he needs to be to secure victory, as we go into the convention, we're of the opinion that it is much more likely some sort of deal will be brokered, which will allow him to simply take the nomination. Now, while I realize that's maybe a little bit of a controversial opinion, given how much conversation and discussion and threats, frankly, there have been in the media and among the sort of senior Republicans about this notion, I mean, just, and this is not a data point, this is more of a qualitative point, but the idea that a majority of Republican voters could choose a candidate who then was still not given, you know, the nomination because of one or two delegates in the count, I think it would be seen as real disenfranchisement of those voters, and I think that would be something Republicans would seek very strongly to avoid. Simply because ideally a convention is about rallying around their candidate, right, the party's candidate, and garnering momentum and support for that candidate, and allowing platforms to be discussed and the troops to be rallied. But if the convention is contested, it really limits the Republicans' ability to do that, to rally around a front runner. And so I think it's more difficult, certainly because it's Trump and because he is so divisive. But I also think if he ends up, for example, at the 1236 in this slide, we'll see him sort of walking into the convention as the presumptive nominee and winner, even if he's not quite there. Now, if the gap is bigger, you know, that's less of a majority and less of a decisive, you know, decision made by Republican primary voters. But I think, you know, if he's within a hair's breadth, he's just as good as there. That's my personal opinion more than anything. Anyway, I was going to talk a little bit about turnout, because what's been very interesting this primary cycle is the difference in turnout between the Republican primaries and the Democratic primaries. As you can see from this chart, and this is primaries only, I should know, we haven't included caucuses here, although the trend is the same, but caucuses are sort of a different animal. What you'll see is that if we compare the Republican turnout this year to the last contested Republican primary cycle, which was 2012, of which Mitt Romney, of course, emerged as the victor, you'll see a notable increase in turnout, very substantial, especially in places like Texas and Ohio, Georgia, and Virginia, the jump is massive. Some of this is related to specific issues at the state level, but because it's so across the board, there's a clear trend in higher Republican turnout, which speaks to a highly motivated base. And no doubt Trump's presence in this election cycle is playing a role in this. Conversely, if you look at the blue bars, what you see is that for the most part, turnout has dropped. And this isn't compared to 2012, when, of course, Obama was the nominee, but compared to 2008, which was the last time there was a contested Democratic primary, which, of course, Obama came out as the victor from. And you'll note that in some cases the drop is a little, but in others it's pretty substantial. And to me, what this says is that even though the Democratic primary process is highly contested, Bernie Sanders has absolutely been giving Clinton a run for her money, we're not seeing that same level of turnout or sort of, passion maybe. And that differential turnout to me speaks a little bit to the notion that where Trump is perhaps motivating to the base of the Republican Party, Clinton does not seem to be having quite the same effect on the base of her party. Now, certainly there is some movement around Bernie Sanders and who he's bringing sort of out in this election cycle. The Bernie Bros, I'm sure people have read about, but sort of younger male voters and younger higher education, higher income voters. But he's not been sort of, winning these contests with a few exceptions. And so really with Clinton as the clear front runner in the Democratic primary, we are seeing a real drop-off in turnout. So does that matter? The answer to me, I'm afraid, is both yes and no. If you look at the data empirically, when we look at sort of past turnouts at both primaries and general elections, it's not a perfect correlation. So high or low turnout at the primaries do not necessarily relate to or predict even a higher turnout for those specific parties at the general. We know from academic literature around voting behavior that the things that make people turn up to vote and excite them about elections and make them want to cast their vote on election day are differentials, right? Candidates being very different to each other, as well as a highly competitive race, which speaks to things like media coverage and others as well. And while Clinton and Trump are obviously very, very different to each other, and the race will undoubtedly be contested, I'm not sure this tells the full story when it comes to this upcoming general election, because the biggest challenge Clinton and the Democrats have really is getting the coalition who elected Obama into office, who were younger. They brought younger voters and minority voters, African American voters in particular, to the polls. Whether she's going to be able to recreate those coalitions. And again, indicative only, but the evidence thus far from the primaries does not necessarily suggest the same level of excitement for her as a candidate as opposed to Barack Obama. And so I do think this is a bit of an uphill battle that Clinton will need to be waging in the coming months as she campaigns. Because she is the establishment, and in many ways she is the ideal candidate for somebody like Trump, who is so categorically anti-establishment, and Clinton is literally a legacy. And so I think that the turnout factor here is immensely important, and the thing we're going to be keeping a very, very close eye on. So we model turnout. Some of you who may have participated in earlier webinars will know that we model election outcomes by looking at past data, looking for trends, and using those trends and predictions about future events, right? We do the same with turnout. So what we've done here, and I'll explain the squiggly line in just a second, but what we've done is essentially look back at the last few elections, at 2014 and 2012, and we've looked at what people told us they were going to do at this point, right now, 8 or 9 months before the election, in terms of voting at the general. Are you going to vote in November is essentially the question. And then we looked at actual turnout among those people in November, and we created essentially a correction factor, right? And so that little model allows us to make not perfect, but a decent prediction about what turnout may look like this November. And what that model is showing us is the orange squiggly line you're seeing right here in front of you, and it's kind of hovering between the 2000 and 2012 turnout, which is sort of between 50 and 55%. And what's interesting about that is that's significantly down on the high turnout in 2008 that really solidified Obama's win. And we've only really hit at one point immediately around Iowa, even the level of turnout that we saw in 2012, of course, which again saw a victory for Obama. And so why is this important? Why does the absolute turnout percentage matter so much? Well, again, if you've been on one of these webinars before, you know the answer to this, because the answer is that higher turnout benefits the Democrats. It's sort of a modern political fact, truth. What this little chart shows, and I'm going to use your little pointer, Chris, that was cool, is that this, the x-axis here is turnout level. It's not over time, it's simply turnout, lower to higher levels of turnout, as well as, of course, the vote share along the other axis. And so as we can see that as turnout increases, Democratic vote share also increases relative to Republican. You see here, this is where the lines cross, and this is the 2012 turnout, where we saw Obama about 3 points ahead of his competitor Romney. If we move back to what the turnout was for the midterms here, around 30-35%, we see a much larger Republican lead. And these are only two examples of the last two elections, but this is a truism for the past few decades as well. So the reason turnout matters, and I'm going to go back one slide here, and I'm going to move this little arrow out of the way, sorry. The reason turnout matters, and the absolute turnout matters, is because objectively speaking, it impacts immensely who is going to win, especially as we move into that sort of magical territory where the blue and the red lines cross right here. I should note as a final point before I pass back to Chris to talk about the Republican race, that when I'm talking about turnout in all of these slides, we're talking about VAP, which is voter age population turnout, which is why the 55% number is marked here for the 2012. Some of you may be more familiar with about the 66-67% turnout figure from 2012. That's what we know, what's known as VEP, voter eligible population turnout. It's two different ways of measuring the same thing. One sort of factoring in things like the incarcerated population, et cetera. But in case there are any questions about why those numbers look less familiar, it's because we're using the VAP rather than the VEP. I know a lot of you are researchers, so I am anticipating getting that question. All right. Anyway, back over to Chris, please, to talk about the Republican primary process and where we are right now.
All right, thanks, Julia. So, again, returning back to focusing on the Republican race, I think that it has been very eventful, probably one of the more eventful presidential campaigns of recent memory. And it's, in the last couple of weeks, has actually gotten even more, I think, interesting from a research perspective, potentially caustic. So last time we spoke, there were 5 Republican candidates still in the race, and we have since lost 2 of those. Marco Rubio and Ben Carson have dropped out of the race after the March 15th primaries, which leaves us with 3, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, John Kasich. You can see Donald Trump is still leading in the polls with almost half of Republicans nationally. Ted Cruz and John Kasich have both seen spikes in their polling numbers since the departure of their rivals. John Kasich has probably enjoyed the greatest gain in support, though he still remains in 3rd place overall. And I think one of the things that's been most interesting about this election for the Republicans lately is just how hostile it's become in the language. If you just do a relatively simple Google search of Trump and attacks, you see the number of hits spike from under 1 million in the weeks leading up to South Carolina to 16 million in the week just the days just before and the week after the March 15th primary. So you can see this huge spike in the number of sort of critical comments on the internet about Donald Trump, or that Donald Trump's leveling back at his opponents, to sort of illustrate just how potentially caustic the debate has become. And that's important because it's actually having an impact. As we discussed earlier, Donald Trump is most likely going to be the Republican nominee. And as Julie was talking about, the Republicans are going to need to coalesce around him to have a chance of winning in the fall. However, the course of this election has actually driven up negative feelings about Donald Trump inside the Republican Party. So this chart shows the number of people giving Donald Trump unfavorable ratings by who they're voting for. So this light blue line is among Ted Cruz supporters. So these are people who say they're voting for Ted Cruz. Back before Iowa, 29% of them said they had unfavorable attitudes towards Donald Trump. Now it's 45%. Likewise with Marco Rubio, 43% before Iowa said they had unfavorable attitudes towards Trump. Now 51%. Of course, Rubio's out of the race, so these people don't really exist anymore in terms of this chart. But, you know, up to this point it was. Kasich didn't even have enough supporters early on for us to really talk about this. But then you see this big spike in unfavorable ratings among Kasich supporters towards Trump. And then, of course, among Trump's own supporters, there's very few that actually have unfavorable attitudes, as you'd expect. So what we see essentially happening is that, particularly for Cruz and Kasich, they're representing an increasingly large chunk of the Republican Party. North of 40% of Republicans support these two guys now. And among their supporters, about half hold unfavorable attitudes towards Donald Trump. So you essentially see a quarter of the Republican Party now holds unfavorable attitudes towards Trump, relative to back before the primary started when it was less than 1 in 10. Okay, so what? So maybe, you know, they have unfavorable attitudes. Well, when we look at the horse race for the general election now, we see a 7-point gap between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, 44 to 37. So Hillary Clinton wins in November. Well, maybe, maybe not. So 1 in 5 likely voters say they wouldn't vote or they don't know. And if you look closely at these likely voters, most of them, 2 to 1 margin, are Republican, conservative, middle-aged and older white voters. These are people who, generally speaking, would be Republican voters. These are people who look like Republicans and sound like Republicans and talk like Republicans, but they don't necessarily say they're pulling the trigger. And the reason why is these people who say they wouldn't vote, have very unfavorable attitudes towards Donald Trump. Like, I'm talking like 50% or more of them say they're very unfavorable towards Trump. So there's this sort of issue that there's this huge block of people, of which 2/3 of which are probably Republicans. They're very unfavorable towards Donald Trump. And part of that is being caused by this caustic primary, I think. The thing that's really interesting looking at this is if you were to take these people who currently say they wouldn't vote and just divided them up between Clinton and Trump based on their party ID and their ideology, this race would be essentially tied. Hillary Clinton would be at about 50, Donald Trump would be at about 48. So you can see that there's actually some really interesting information in these people, and the course of this primary has actually had an impact on how the election is playing out. Now, what's going to happen in the months to come? Well, that's hard to say. Chances are that after the nomination fight's done and once Trump has actually achieved a majority of delegates and gets nominated and confirmed as the Republican candidate, some of these people will probably come home and you're going to see these numbers tighten. I don't think we're going to see in November a 7 or 8 point margin between the candidates. It's naturally going to tighten to a closer race. The real question is going to be about how hard a time Donald Trump has bringing these people back into the fold. Back to you, Julia.
Great, thank you. Very interesting stuff. I'm going to, I think at this point, just throw it open to questions. There's a couple topics we haven't touched as much on, things like the impact of the recent events in Brussels, of course, and as much detail on the Democratic race, although that's mostly because we've assumed that that's pretty much over. But we're happy to take questions on any of those topics, or, of course, on anything else that you have. And we've got one coming in already.
Hello, everyone. We are
John
unable to
Kasich
take
says he is
questions
the one
for
the
our
poll shows
presenters
can
at this
be Clinton.
time. So if you do have anything that you would like to ask the presenters, please send it over to me at zina@thearf.org, and I'm happy to submit them to the presenters. They will reach out to you personally. I thank Cliff, Julia, and
Let's take questions on any of those topics, or, of course, on anything else in already. Here we go. John Kasich says he is the one the poll shows can beat Clinton in the fall. What data would demonstrate this? We got actually a similar question when we did a sort of an internal webinar on this earlier today. Chris, I'll pass it back to you if you don't mind, because I think you had those numbers right in front of you.
Yep. Hold on just one moment. I do have those numbers not right in front of me, unfortunately.
All right. Well, let me.
So we've been doing head-to-head polling for the last couple of days, and John Kasich actually does perform better against Hillary Clinton than either Trump or Ted Cruz does among registered voters. With registered voters, there is about an 8-point margin between Clinton and Trump or Clinton and Cruz. Between Clinton and Kasich, though, there's a 3 or 4 point margin. So it is a narrower divide for Kasich. So it does sort of it does give his claim some credit.
I would add, however, that at this point in the election cycle, the head-to-heads, even the ones filtered on likely voters, don't have great reliability. We have some really interesting data looking at sort of time out from election day for horse race polls versus accuracy of those said polls. And at this point in the election cycle, even head-to-head races among likely voters, and when I say head-to-head, I mean sort of, November data, right? The sort of Trump versus Clinton, Kasich versus Clinton. There's about a 6 or 7 point error associated with those. Not shocking to anyone. Polls get more accurate as we near election day, as people get better at predicting what they're actually going to do and how likely they actually are to vote. So I agree that Kasich probably has polling, as we all do, that suggests that he's going to be now seen as closer to being able to beat Clinton. But I would also just caveat that by the fact that polls right now of the general election picture are more complicated, less reliable. So, making that claim is absolutely what he's going to be doing, of course, to shore up support. But, if I were asked right now to support that claim, I wouldn't necessarily be able to, simply because we know that kind of such early polling is not highly predictive.
hello, everyone. Thank you. That was all we could take for questions. I do thank you for joining us for our webcast today. I do want to thank Cliff, Julia, and Chris Jackson for joining us and hosting our webcast for today. We will have more upcoming events for webcasts next week with Nielsen Catalina and the following week with Distillery. If you have any questions, please send them to me, zina@thearf.org, and I'll forward them on to our presenters. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.